Okay, so I learn more about Mongolia every year, and one of the reasons why I started Mongolian Data Stories and do the work that I do is because I want to learn more about Mongolia, because there are, Mongolia, as you guys know, is not like that many other countries, or not actually that usual for even developing countries, because you guys have this, East-West mentality and background and history, and it's very fascinating to me. I pushed the wrong button. There we go. So let me just tell you briefly about me, because I have a little bit of a weird background, I guess, and it's not, I guess, typical of what you might want to think of like as a Mongolian researcher or something like that. So my academic background is actually in political science. I studied, political science in the US, and I then briefly worked for the US House of Representatives for a member of Congress. And I say briefly because I did it for about a year and I realized I didn't like it. It was like, oh, this is supposed to be my dream job, right? And it was my dream job, and I hated it. And it wasn't because of the job, actually. I love the people I worked with. I loved the actual job. It was just politics, right? I just realized that politics was dirty. So I left, and I started working for an IT company called DXC. At the time, it was called CSC, Computer Sciences Corporation, but today it's called DXC Technology. And it's an IT outsourcing firm. And then eventually I became a consultant for KPMG, doing IT management consulting too. And so I jumped from politics to IT, which is a really weird shift. But IT has always been a passion of mine. And I also like politics and social science. So in 2013, I actually moved to Mongolia, and we started the school program. And I also created in 2017 Mongolian Data Stories. And then in addition to what Narentsok mentioned about Mongol.ai, which I did start a for-profit company as well, I created Songolt.org. And I'll give you an example of something I made for Songolt in just a bit, actually at the end of the presentation. So here's what I'm going to talk about. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is like what the data science process is that I follow. And pretty much every data scientist in the world follows the same process. And so I want to go over that briefly so you understand how I work and what perspective I work from. And the other things I'm going to talk about, they seem very negative, okay? And I don't want you to get that negative perception, because most of the time I made these titles just because to get people interested and not necessarily to actually show much negative things about Mongolia. Each of these little stories I'm going to tell you about has a positives and negatives. I mean, there's always two sides to the story. So I'm going to show you both sides. Including murder in Mongolia sounds really morbid and sad, but it's actually not as bad as people think. And we'll talk about all of these things. So we'll talk about youth unemployment first, which is, there's not too much positive about that, unfortunately. It's just really bad. Debt, we'll also talk about debt in Mongolian and private debt. We'll talk about murder. The Tsagaan debt cycle, as I call it, which is kind of a name that I just made up. But how Tsagaan debt negatively impacts sort of older population in Mongolia. And then we'll talk about the meat price roller coaster, and you'll understand why it's called a roller coaster in a bit. And then I'll talk to you about some air pollution and then also some election data. So there's like several things we're going to go through. I'm going to show you guys a lot of pictures. There's not going to be so many words, and that's because most of it is just code and complex ideas, and I think the pictures make a lot more sense. So let me tell you about this data science process. I use what's called the CRISP-DM process. It's not a new process. Data science is a new field, but the CRISP-DM process was made, I think, in the 1970s. It stands for Cross-Industry Standard Process for Data Mining. And it's a 76-page document that was created a long time ago that data scientists today follow as the process. And this picture, like right here, is kind of the flow that it goes through. And it always starts with where you understand the problem, you collect some data, you prepare the data, you do some modeling, you get the answer, and you check whether it's right or wrong. At any step of the process, you might realize that, uh-oh, I screwed up, I have to go back. And it's kind of like if you know the Mamu game for kids where you have to slide and you can go up and down. Like my son plays it, he likes it. And so sometimes you hit a square and you have to actually slide backwards, right? It's just like the board game. And this is kind of a frustrating process because sometimes I'll try to be solving a problem and I just can't because the data is not enough, or I don't have the right kind of data, or maybe I was asking the wrong question, because sometimes that actually just happens, right? I'm not asking the right question. So you'll see through some of this where I'll kind of mention some of these kind of holes that I fell into throughout the way. So let's talk about youth unemployment. And you can't really make these out, and I kind of intended you not to be able to make it out, but this is the raw unemployment data that I got. And this unemployment is just a table of numbers, right? I got this unemployment data from the National Statistical Office, which is like my favorite place to go for all things data. I've worked with the National Statistical Office on many projects. They're great to work with. They're very easy to work with, which is great. They know what they're talking about. So it's great to get data from them. But of course, they don't actually collect all the data that they get. Most of the time, they get their data from other ministries. So if you ask them, how did you make the data? And they say, I don't know, I didn't make it. I just collected it. So that's sometimes a negative, but you get good data here. And this is just some numbers. And if you look at these numbers, this is kind of what you get when you watch a news report. They just say, in 2020, the unemployment rate reached X%. You're like, okay, what does that mean, right? Or you can say, oh, unemployment went up 10% this year. Okay, from what, right? And oftentimes when you see data stories in the media, they don't tell you the context. What's the situation, right? What's happening? They try to give you a human story, which is great because it tells you, about the humans, right? And that's what people care about. But it doesn't really tell you the whole picture. So what I did was I kind of flipped it around a little bit, and I tried to visually see what was happening. So I can actually here, I'll zoom in here so it's a little bit easier to read. Here we go. So the more recent years is really what's important. I actually made this in 2017, so it's kind of old now. But so you can see here in 2016, right? And then over here is the age groups. And of course, this is the unemployment rate. And red is bad, and sort of green-blue is good, okay? And you can see, and this is basically the same data, right? But I'm just making a heat map instead of just a data table. And you can see that, well, the age 15 to 19 is way over 20% unemployment, right? That's probably not good. If you look 70 plus, of course, there's basically no unemployment, right? Because they're probably retired, I hope. But in the middle, there's basically, somewhat average unemployment, maybe around 6%, 7%, which is a pretty good unemployment rate. The reason why I did this was because it really put in perspective the situation. When you just look at numbers, it doesn't really give you a whole picture of what's happening. When you look at this, you can kind of visualize in your mind. Well, when you're 15, how many 15-year-old Mongolians do you know that actually have a job? I mean, it's actually not very common, right? People, they're expected to go to school. They're expected to get an education. And then when they turn 18, if they're not in school, if you're a guy, you go to the military, right? That's kind of like what's expected, right? But even if they don't have a job, that's considered a working age adult in Mongolia, right? And you are able to get a job at that age, but most don't. And so, of course, you see very high unemployment for these people. And then around 20 to 24, it's just as bad, right? This is, college age, potentially graduated from college, at least their undergraduate degree, and they still don't have a job, at least more than 20, 25% of them, right? And this is a common story that you guys hear about all the time, right? I mean, it's just like you live this every day. And so you don't really need to see these, although it does put it in perspective. And you can see that it slowly, gradually gets better until about middle age, and then it gets even better as you get older. And so the real story I wanted to show here was that, well, as you get older, it becomes a lot easier to get a job, right? Doesn't necessarily mean you have better qualifications, which I think is interesting to think about, because if you look at down here, between males and females, you also see, especially in 2016 where it got bad, there was a little bit of an economic dip in 2016 in Mongolia, you see that males were disproportionately impacted here as well, which is kind of interesting. So this is one story I wanted to show, and I think it really puts in perspective kind of the situation. And you can also see over time, very easily, right, what's actually happening. And it's a nice way to see it. The next one's kind of hard to read, so I apologize. I made it in Tableau, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad. This is showing debt and deposits, okay? So this blue down here says outstanding deposits. So this is how much money do people have in the bank. And then here, this is outstanding loans. And I got this data again from the statistical office, but you can also get this data from Mongol Bank if you'd like. It's on the Mongol Bank website. And what I wanted to show was that, basically the title of the story was Mongolians are more in debt now than ever, but they're also richer than ever. Because what you're really looking at here is you're looking at the height of these, right? The height of this stacked plot. So when you look at the height of this plot, and this is 2016, they're almost the same, right? And in fact, deposits are even a little bit bigger, right? So, a lot of people get scared when they look at this and they say, oh my God, look, debt is just going shooting up and Mongolia isn't such a big problem and we're all gonna die, right? No, but it's not really like that, because also you have to look at deposits as well, right? And deposits are a big part of the story with debt. Debt in itself is not necessarily a negative thing. And any economist will tell you this, right? That debt can be a positive thing for the economy. So I said, okay, but hold on, this doesn't tell the whole story, right? What else can I look at it with? So I made a map. So this map actually shows the average amount of debt in millions of tulgriks for each IMEG, okay? And you can see here that it's actually pretty low. You might think, oh, the average debt per person, right, is about 1.8 million tulgriks. And this is, again, 2016. Yeah, I put it here. 2016 in millions of MNT. So you see, okay, Ulf's over here is 2 million. Omnagov is 1.9. Dornogovi, which is only 2.66, okay? So it's higher. But you'll notice Ulaanbaatar. You don't see Ulaanbaatar here, right? It's just white. That's because it was too high. So Ulaanbaatar, the average debt is 26.88 million tulgriks per person, per capita. Now this, of course, doesn't mean that your child has debt, right? I mean, that's not what that means. But it just means that we took the entire debt that's attributed to Ulaanbaatar residences or businesses or whatever and divided it by the number of people in the city, right, that live in the city. And that's 26.88 million. That's a really crazy number. And so it starts to put into perspective this debt situation. And it starts to also tell you, where is the economic engine of the country, right? Where is all of the money flowing? And it's really only flowing in Ulaanbaatar. Maybe a little bit in, the mining zone of the country, right? And that's about it. And that was actually really, I learned a lot from that. Because a lot of people said, oh, in the countryside, there's a lot of these big projects, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, you hear that, but you don't necessarily see it. And I think, even if you have a project in the countryside somewhere, the debt is going to be almost always in Ulaanbaatar, which means that's where the banks register the debt, that's where the companies are registered, that's where everything's happening. And that was actually quite interesting for me, because I learned a lot from that, which is to say that, unfortunately, it looks like that you don't have these companies or actually effective large-scale industry in the countryside that actually is accumulating debt. If you did have a large company, every large company has debt. Doesn't matter who it is. Apple, they get loans, right? And that's part of the way that they conduct business. You have to get loans because it helps cash flow. And that's just a normal way that you conduct business. And if you see that there's not actually debt being accumulated outside of the city, it means that there's not really any city or companies actually having activities there. So that was kind of interesting for me. Or at least, again, this is all based on official statistics, right? So official statistics meaning this might be from Mongol Bank, which is reported by commercial banks, which is then reported to the National Statistical Office, right? Now, of course, commercial banks don't have any reason to lie, right? I mean, potentially, they don't want to lose money for no reason, right? I mean, they're a money-making business, right? So it's something to think about. And again, if you have questions about this, I'd love to talk about it later. The next thing I want to talk about is murder, which is kind of a sad topic, but the reason why I said this is because this was a tweet from the Statistical Office, and they make these tweets occasionally, and they're quite informative, I think. But they said, oh, look, last year in 2017, and I did this in 2018, so 2017 in September, I guess, you saw that there was 26,657 reported crimes, okay? Cool. Then in 2018, the same month, there was 31,000. You must think, okay, what's happening? Where's all the crime? Are people stealing stuff? What's going on, right? And this, I think, I was really shocked at this number. I was like, okay, there's more crimes. And, I mean, does that mean that I should lock my door at night? I mean, should I make sure that I double check to make sure my car is locked? I mean, what does this really mean, right? There's no context here. And so I was really kind of confused about this. I was like, what am I actually doing with these numbers? And you can actually see that here, this is the differences in the crime levels, right? The severity of the crimes here as well. And I said, this doesn't really tell you a good story. So what I did was, I said, let's just look at murder, right? Because murder is the worst crime ever, right? I mean, that's pretty much, you can't get anything worse than murder. And so, so what I did was I created there's a name for this, I forgot what it is. It's basically a mapped bar chart. So the position of each IMEG is roughly where it is in Mongolia. And then each of these is basically a mini bar chart, okay? And what it does is it shows you whether the comparison between the average crime rate for that year for that IMAG. So for example, in Bainulgi, you can see blue is low and then red is above, okay? You can see the Bainulgi is actually almost, every year under the national average for murder, right? And actually you see this all in Western Mongolia. It's actually quite impressive. Except for Gobi Altai for that 1 year, for whatever reason, it was higher. But you can see this quite low. Now you can also see that over here, you see some of these bigger ones here. But then you also see Ulaanbaatar, which is basically flat, right? What does that tell you? So you can see it's basically flat. There's a little blip here in the last year, in 2017. Does it really tell you anything, though? And if you think about statistically, what does this mean? Well, it means that Ulaanbaatar has half the population of the country. So whatever is normal in Ulaanbaatar is normal for the whole country, right? That becomes the average, right? So whatever the murder rate in Ulaanbaatar, that basically determines the average of the entire country, because there's just so many people in the city compared to the whole country, because that's averages, right? And so you can actually see that it's kind of interesting, but then you also see Tuvameg, which was really bad and then somehow got better. I'm not sure why. But then this is kind of weird, Obviously Dornogovi is like the worst place to live, right? No, not really. You really shouldn't assume that either, because, and I actually found out that the difference is that, like this highest bar here, or even Omnogovi, this highest bar, there might have been like 6 murders the entire year in the whole AMIC, and that made that bar so high, right? That's not that many murders. I'm from America, which actually this is a quick question. Which country has the lower murder rate, the United States or Mongolia? Definitely the United States. Yeah, and this is another interesting thing, which I don't actually have a slide for this, but I can show you the numbers, which is really easy to show. They're actually quite comparable now, because the Mongolian murder rate's been going down, but it's about 6.4 the last time I checked, murders per 100,000 people, and the US is about 5.4 murders per 100,000 people. And so yeah, actually, and so this is a weird thing, does that mean that Mongolia is like a horribly dangerous country? No, of course not. That's crazy, right? I live here too, right? But I thought this was quite interesting because it at least gives you context, right? It at least shows you, okay, what does this mean, right? And what does this, sort of murder as the, comparison to crime mean? And so you can at least understand it in that way, as opposed to just looking at general statistics, which don't really tell you much, right? How do you know what this means, right? It doesn't really tell you much. So let's talk about Tsagaan debt. This one is going to take a little bit more time to unpack, okay? It's a little bit more complex. Because here I'm not just going to be able to use charts. I'm going to have to use some statistical methods to show you. You guys know Tsagaan, right? I think everyone in here is Mongolian. It's a national tradition, you got to go around everywhere. I do it too every year. And it's expensive, right? It's probably, one of the most expensive times, if not the most expensive time of the year, right? Especially for the older age group, right? They're the ones who have to get all the gifts. They're the ones who have to get all the food, right? And sure, they get some cash, right? But that's not necessarily going to cover all the expenses for the holiday. So I had a question. Do any Mongolians accumulate debt in order to pay for Tsagaan? That was my sort of question, okay, my larger question. And so I got some data from Mongol Bank that shows pension loans and salary loans, okay? I said, okay, salary loans, I would assume you're going to have to be working, right? In order to get a salary loan at a bank, you have to go to the bank, you have to show them how much you get paid, get some letter that you work there or whatever, and you can get a loan. Of course, this is actually, I made this before, right about when Lindemann came out, so now it's like a little bit easier, but still, you had to get a loan of some kind through your work, which means that these people who are getting loans are actually working. Then I also looked at pension loans. So pension loans are when you have a state pension or whatever, and you get a loan using that as collateral, right? So you get some loan based on your pension from the bank. So I asked, a simple question, I guess, which is, can we tell if you get more loans during the first quarter of the year? This is quarterly data. Are there more loans issued in the first quarter of the year? And this would be used to pay for Tsagaan. It's the major holiday in that quarter. It's the only one that would actually make much sense. But looking at this is really hard to tell, right? You'd have to like squint and kind of figure it out and kind of do the math. You could do some other statistical methods. So what I did was I said, well, let's be a little bit smart about this. So I used a library that was developed by Facebook actually called Profit. It's a really great time series modeling tool. And what it does is it basically it looks at the data that you give it and it finds trends in the data. And it says, hey, what is the cycle basically, or the ups and downs based on time for this data set? And what you're going to see here is that you see 1, 2, 3 humps, right? Basically, this is corresponding to the quarters, okay? First quarter, second quarter, third quarter, and then fourth quarter, I guess, is the end of the year, which is basically almost 0. It's very low, okay? So this is kind of an interesting one because, and you can actually see over here, this is basically the change, okay? A positive means it increases, negative means it's decreasing, right? And this is basically the trend over this data set, which is from 2009 to 2019. So it's a 10-year data set. What's the trend like? And actually in salary loans, you can see that, yeah, actually the first quarter, where you would expect to see there to be loans for Tsagaan, it's actually almost the same as the third quarter, right? Which doesn't actually tell you much. It might say, oh, okay, that's almost the same, right? So what that told me was that people who actually have jobs, right, working-aged adults, are not most likely getting extra loans just to pay for Tsagaan, okay? But now let's look at pension loans. Here you can see a pretty clear hump, okay? You can see that the first quarter is significantly higher than the other 2 quarters here. And what that tells me is that, and it's actually quite high compared to the others, and you can see that this is definitely happening. You're definitely seeing that in the first quarter, people who have a pension are getting loans, and that's when they most often would get a loan. You see the biggest increase. And this is one of the things that I was trying to do was say, a lot of you guys may observe things in your daily life, and you may make a conclusion based on that, like an inferential decision making, right? Well, what I wanted to do was let's not use inferences, let's use deduction. Let's actually get the data and really see the pattern. And from here, you can actually see that this is actually happening, right? You don't have to come up with some crazy number to scare people. You can just look at the trend, right? And say this is happening more often in the first quarter, which means that Tsagaan is obviously a financial burden for older people. I mean, this is the conclusion that I came up with. Now, does that mean that there's not some other reason why they're getting pension loans in the first quarter? There could be other reasons, right? And I think it would be crazy not to say that, but it is important to think about. All right, now let's talk about meat, okay? Does everyone in here like meat? Any vegetarians? It's unlikely to be a vegetarian in Mongolia. That's good though. So meat, as you guys may know, is kind of a weird thing in Mongolia. And then when meat prices go up, people get really afraid. And they start freaking out, and social media goes crazy. And it gets so crazy that you actually have police and SWAT gear going to a meat warehouse last year and like with guns, right? It's like, I don't think the cows are gonna shoot back, right? They're already dead. But this happens, right? And you see, this is actually an opinion article. It's important to remember this is an opinion article. It's not their news section. But they said, oh, meat prices are skyrocketing and there's a shortage of meat, right? And this is not really accurate because I don't think Mongolia will ever run out of meat. I mean, there's more than 70 million animals, right? This is way higher than the average of 20 million-ish that was common during socialist period, right? And up until the 90s when they deregulated the meat industry, right? There's more than 70 million animals. So why do meat prices keep going up? That's an interesting idea. And actually, this is the time series from 2011 to 2019 of average beef and mutton prices per kilogram, okay, in Ulaanbaatar. I only looked at Ulaanbaatar because it's the easiest one to look at. And actually, if you ever go to the countryside, you never see like a supermarket with meat in it, right? Because you don't need it. Like it's there. So you can see, like, I call this a roller coaster, right? Because it really looks like a roller coaster. It makes the crazy mouse at the children's park look really nice in comparison, right? I mean, this is actually really crazy. And this is where everyone started to freak out last year. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, it's going above, it's hitting 12,000. This is crazy, right? Send in the police, quick. Something's going on, right? And it was this like really sensational thing. Everyone was talking about it. The Minister of Agriculture was like really stressed out and was like trying to talk about it. And then you have the Notsin Mach and all this other situation, and they're like, how do we deal with this? And it was a really big problem, right? But I said, okay, well, why? And maybe let's better understand. A lot of people were blaming exports. Okay, did you guys hear that? Like everyone's like, oh, it's because they're exporting it to China. Obviously, it's China's fault, right? That's an easy explanation. And so, but I actually wanted to say, okay, let's compare these meat prices to all the other, common things that you might buy, right? And so I kind of did. So the first one here, the blue line, is kind of hard to see. It's right here, if you can kind of see, it goes up and down like that, is beef, okay? The red one is mutton, which basically tracks with the blue one. And then you have the restaurant, I call it the Goulash Index, okay? The National Statistical Office is a really cool thing. They actually go to a bunch of like Zalgengazars and Guanzas and stuff around the city, and they just ask how much goulash with Niesel salad and milk tea costs, right? And they just do that like every month, and they've been doing it for 20 years. It's amazing, okay? And this is a great data, right? Because now we can see that actually goulash, which is like this green color, is actually pretty steady in price. That's pretty impressive. That's a good value, right? And then you can see actually tsuven, like Mongolia's national dish. If there is a national dish, it's got to be tsuven. And you can see that went from 100 to about 200 almost 200 on the index, which means that it's almost doubled in price over the past 10 years, okay? Then you can see the haircuts. This is a good one. Men's haircuts, let's face it, guys don't tend to care as much about their hair as women, right? So men here, and you can see, I guess it's this gray one right here, that's gone up significantly, 300%, right? So it's basically 200% more than it was before. That's crazy. Women, though, is even worse. So it went from 100 in 2011. This is an index, right? So, and then we can go all the way up to more than 300, almost 350, I guess. So that's actually, if you put it in comparison, people complain about their meat a lot, but if you want to complain about something, complain about how much a haircut costs, right? Because that actually keeps going up and up and up and up and up. But that's a service business, right? It's not a commodity product. You pay for something that you think is better, right, with a haircut. Whereas meat is meat, right? You just get it and you assume it's good, right? And I think this is an interesting observation that I made, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. So the next thing I looked at was let's look at inflation, okay? Let's see how inflation has trended compared to meat prices. And it's kind of weird because for whatever reason, and I still don't know why, I've asked many people about this, including like herders and people who are in this industry. What happened in 2011 to 2012 and 13 when meat prices went from an average of 4,000 tugrix per kilo for mutton all the way up to almost 8,000? I don't know what happened in this year. If you know, I would love to talk to you about it because I have no idea what happened. I was not living in Mongolia at the time. I don't know. But meat prices went way up. I don't know if the currency devalued overnight or what, but it clearly didn't because this is actually CPI inflation or consumer price index inflation. And you can see that for a while, meat prices, at least mutton, was actually more expensive compared to inflation, okay? But then it actually got about average and even lower. And then only now is it going back above. And beef told a similar story, which is that it was expensive for a while, but then it kind of got about what you would expect, and then it's going up again now. And it's kind of an interesting story because it's kind of a fact of life. Inflation means that everything gets more expensive every day. It's just normal, right? It's true in Mongolia, it's true in America, it's true in pretty much every country. Inflation makes things more expensive, right? And so the prices going up is kind of a natural thing. But when you have a big spike, people really notice, right? So I wanted to look at it now as, let's see how much people are spending on meat as a share of their average income, okay? And so I assumed, okay, this is some assumptions here, okay, that the average person assumes 250 grams of meat per day for 3 people. This is probably low for Mongolia, I realize, because people do eat a lot of meat here, right? But I just made this assumption because it doesn't really matter how much you use, right? It just basically shifts the graph up or down, okay? And basically you saw back in 2011, people were spending between 20 and 30% of their income on meat if they were buying mutton or beef. But then now they're actually spending maybe only 15 to 20%. right? Because the average salaries have gone up significantly. And again, this is in Ulaanbaatar, okay? But the average salary in Ulaanbaatar more than doubled in the same time period, right? Which I think is an interesting comparison as well. Now, does that mean that everyone is spending less money on meat? No, right? Because not everyone makes the average salary. And in fact, you can make a good argument that even more, that the average salary is maybe a little inflated because of various factors. But that's fine. Then I said, okay, let's actually make a forecast, okay? Let's try to make a meat price forecast. And before you start thinking I can tell the future, this is really hard to do, okay? Because we don't know what's actually going to happen in the future. And especially last year, I could have never expected the coronavirus pandemic, right? I mean, no one can predict something like that. So I said, okay, well, I did this in around, I guess May of 2019. And I said, well, this is the price now. And I used a nice statistical tool also from Facebook, the same library called Profit. And I said, let's actually predict with an 80% confidence interval what the price will be in 1 year. I was way off, okay? Because I don't know what happened, but meat kept going up. It didn't follow the normal trend last year, and I do not know why. Because, in fact, as a really weird thing, they stopped exporting meat in 2019 because of this, in response to this. They said, we're going to slow down imports of meat. And then they eventually, this year, they've almost exported no meat, right? But the prices continue to go up, right? So this explanation that exports are to blame definitely do not seem to be correct at this point. Because if you look at the export numbers, which I just did today, because I wanted to update this slide, that the amount of meat that was exported in 2019 was no higher and was actually a little bit lower than from 2018 to 2019. But the number of animals went up by like 5 or 6%, right? Because we had a really good winter last year, right? So what the heck, right? That's weird. Why do prices keep going up? And actually you can see here, this is when I made the forecast right around here, and it kept going up way above my forecast. And then after Nadam, which is typically when meat prices go down, right? You guys probably may notice this. Right after Nadam is when it normally happens. And then they kept going up. And it didn't go down until early 2020. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, right? And then everyone started freaking out, and the prices went right back up in February, which is very unusual. It almost never goes up in the early part of the year. Because, and actually, if you guys spend any time in the countryside and ask people, herders do not like to kill their animals in the spring, right? Because it's when they're having babies. And so they don't want to kill their animals because they may produce more babies, offspring, right? Which they could then use to make their herds bigger. But that's exactly what happened, Like you would expect, though, that prices to jump a little bit in the beginning of the year, and then they would go up until the middle of the year, and then right at the end of the summer, they go down again. Until the beginning of the year, they go up, and then they go down. But that's not exactly what happened last year. And then, of course, the pandemic happened, which is a weird event, which we can never really deal with what's going to happen after that. So meat prices, especially for me, are very fascinating because last year I said meat prices in Mongolia are actually very predictable. And of course, I was proved wrong, like immediately, right? And this is one of the big challenges with doing data science, right? At least forecasting, because something like coronavirus happens or the market just says, nope, you're wrong, sorry. So that's kind of unfortunate and very frustrating, but whatever. So I'm going to show you 2 more projects. One is I did just for the election, at least the parliamentary election, not the local election. I wanted to kind of I'd never done this before, and it was one of those things that the last parliamentary election I wish I had done, but I couldn't do it, partially because the way that the election system was done, it was very hard from a data science perspective to analyze the election districts, right? The taudriks. It was really difficult because they were very local districts with down to the Sum level, or at least in Ulaanbaatar, it was down to the Horo level. But this last parliamentary election, they had much larger election districts. So it was easier to analyze. And so I said, okay, I'm going to do it finally. I wanted to learn what's the difference between local maybe, or even within Ulaanbaatar, what's the difference between these areas, right? What are maybe the demands or requirements of these areas? It's not something people talk about much. And it's one of the things I wanted to look at. Now, I actually worked with Dr. Dirkes from the University of British Columbia on this, and he actually follows Mongolian politics quite a bit. So I was kind of discussing this with him as I went. And I really thought it was something interesting to look at. Now, this is actually a website So if you want to, you can go there. It's still there. And I kind of made just a little GIF so you guys can see how it works. So you pick your election area. And then, so this, I'm going to compare Tsagaan Kharkhan with Bulgan, which are basically the most population with the lowest population. And then I made several charts. So things like loan percentages, like this. You can see how it ranks compared to all the other areas. Percentage, work, unemployment, average education levels, crime rates, and then also things like about how people live. Where do they live in gars? Do they live in houses? What kind of water do they have? What kind of toilets do they have? And stuff like that. And actually, all this data is available, which I think is amazing. But it took a lot of work. It took me over a week to do this, okay, to collect the data. The app was easy to make. That took me, maybe 2 or 3 days. But the data, just collecting the data from 4 or 5 different sources, putting it all together, cleaning it, and analyzing it, that took a lot of time. But I learned a lot. I learned, for example, just because you're the richest area in the country, which is Hanul district, no surprise, does not mean you have the highest education level, which goes to Bengal, which is quite interesting, right? And I also learned things like, the average loan amounts, and I learned about like crime rates. And then more interesting for me was the average unemployment and employment rates. Because it turns out that, and I showed other things as well. And it turns out that people actually, are quite a bit different. And the lifestyles, I mean, you guys know this, right? But when I first brought this idea up with Dr. Dierkes, he said, everyone always says the same thing. It's always UB versus the countryside, UB versus the countryside. And I said, well, maybe it's not like that. Maybe the people in Tsagaan Kharkhan have very significant different needs than the people in Hanul district, right? But that's not actually what people talk about. But it is true. That's what I found, right? I mean, you have large differences in education levels. You have differences in the way people live. You have differences in unemployment and employment rates. You have different salary levels, right? And no one really pays attention to this much. It's not, I don't think it's, like anyone's fault. I think it's just the way that kind of politics is in the country. So I at least wanted to look at that and better understand, which is pretty cool. And if you want to explore this for yourself, you can. Again, it's election.tsagaan.org. You can just play with it. It works on a phone too, but not as well. It's better on a laptop or a desktop. The next thing I made was for air pollution. And I actually made this last year, I guess. And so you guys are all probably familiar with Agaar.mongol.ai, right? You might even check it now that it's getting colder. Now that the air pollution, you actually might even go there. Maybe you have the app on your phone. A lot of people are familiar with this, right? And I took this screenshot yesterday. You can see what it looks like. But it doesn't really tell you a story, right? It doesn't say, oh, right now in Baranduruzam, you have like 148 for AQI, okay? Okay, so what? What does that mean, right? Was it bad? What about next hour? Or what about yesterday? What was it like yesterday, right? Or what was it like when I was actually walking around there 2 days ago? Do I remember? No. And you can't really find out from this site. And it's not their fault. I think they made a nice website. It's pretty, it's usable, right? But it doesn't really tell you a lot of context. So what I did was I made a sort of an analytics dashboard of all of the air pollution data going back to 2015, okay? This is a database of more than, I think, 10 million rows of data now. It's a lot of data that I've been collecting for the past couple of years. And I collect it from every air pollution station in the city, including the US Embassy, and including People in Need, which is a local NGO, an international NGO. They actually have their own air quality sensors, so I'll also collect those from a site called Air Visual. And I'm putting it all together in a database because it doesn't actually exist all in one spot, right? So I wanted to put it in one spot and analyze it. And what I did basically, and this is actually the US Embassy one, I made an interactive dashboard so you can say, hey, what's air pollution like this month compared to last month? What about last year? What about the year before, right? And I then said, well, let's take a look at the different months and let's compare the weather from last year and this year in the same month. A lot of people say, oh, last year was a warm winter, right? Or this year is colder than normal. Or, actually last year was a pretty warm winter, right? And this year, everyone's talking about a zud or whatever. We don't know what's going to happen, right? But it might be colder than last year. So I really wanted to compare it. And then the other thing I did was, which is, it'll have to cycle through again. Oh, here actually, and again, it's interactive. So you can actually see what the data is like. And you can actually compare it over different times. And again, if you click on this drop down here, you can actually see every air pollution station in the city, at least the official ones. And then you can also select the pollutant. So like there's different pollutants like PM 2.5 or PM 10. And then if you look at the days, I'm actually quite interested to see this. The problem is, I saw this, the Ministry of Environment came up with an article, I guess like, there was actually a paper written as well, I guess a few months ago at the beginning of the summer about like air quality has gotten, air pollution is reduced 40%, right? You guys may have even heard this number, right? It was all over TV, everyone was talking about it. And I think that's true, okay? Totally true. But they're comparing it to only 1 year, right? But if you guys have lived in Mongolia long enough, you know that it changes. Every year it's different. So it's like saying, well, today traffic is worse than yesterday. Does that mean that traffic is going to continue to get worse? Of course not. You have 2 data points, right? Yes, you can make a line. It doesn't mean that line is true, right? And so I made this because I wanted to give people a better way to use it. Now the problem is it's kind of hard to understand. And I think average people just, of course, don't know how to use this, right? Unless you have some experience working with data or looking at interactive visualizations or understanding how this thing works, it's quite difficult, right? But I at least wanted to start with something so people could at least have some comprehension of the complexity of the situation. And it's not as simple as just, oh, it got 10% better. It got 30% better, right? And I think, and again, I don't think they're lying or anything. It did. It got 40% better than the previous year. Okay, so what, right? There was, what was it? I guess a few weeks ago, traffic was like crazy, right? Totally insane. But it's been like that for 10 years, right? So everyone was complaining on social media, right? But then now it's like, oh, okay, now it's like, and then like I said on Twitter, I was like, everyone's going to forget in a few weeks. No one's going to remember. Everyone's just going to complain, and then it's going to stop, because that's what happens every year. And I think it's kind of similar with air pollution, which is unfortunate, right? Because it's a real problem. So data science in Mongolia. There are a lot of different challenges, of course, especially with data. We don't always have the data we want. But there's also a lot of opportunities, because there is a lot of data out there. And hopefully, if I can show you anything this whole presentation, is that you do have data at your fingertips and you can use it. So you should make the most of what you have, right? And that's it.